Saturday today, and we are going to go through the steps of how to make a dry rub for our spare ribs or for your portobello mushrooms. And I'm going to walk you through making the dry rub, cutting our meat, because we want to make sure our spare ribs fit on our sheet tray, and then we're going to show you how to rub your spare ribs with the dry rub. So the first thing I'm going to do while my hands are still clean is I'm going to take my foil and I'm going to just line my sheet tray with 2 sheets of foil, just to make sure it covers the entire sheet tray, the sheet pan. And then go ahead and leave your foil out because we're going to use it to cover the ribs later. So what I'm doing is I just, it doesn't reach all the way to the end of the sheet tray, so I'm just putting an extra layer on. And then just kind of tightly lining the sheet tray. And go ahead and put it aside. And then, while our hands are clean still, we're going to make our dry rub. So I keep a lot of dry rubs around the house. I think they're really handy, not around the house, but on my kitchen counter. I think they're really handy to have because if you have a piece of pork, or if you have a piece of chicken, or vegetables like carrots and eggplant, or peppers, anything that you want to roast in the oven, it's often makes it really flavorful if you add a dry rub, if you just sprinkle some of these spices over it. So I'll just show you really quickly what I have. And I make it in advance, and I make a big batch of it, and it just sits in a jar on my counter. So this one is kind of like a barbecue flavor. So I put this on chicken, I put this on pork, you can put it on steak, and you just rub it into the meat, and I'll show you how we do that later. And it's just handy, it's just flavor already in a jar, and you just sprinkle it over your vegetables and your meat. So this one has like cumin and garlic powder and salt, and I think some brown sugar in here. And you should totally feel free to experiment. You don't have to follow a strict recipe. You can, as long as you have some flavors that you really like that would go together, you can go ahead and make your own dry rub mixture and just keep it on the counter. This is one that my friend Melissa made me, and it has like North African spices, so I can tell it has cumin and coriander, and I think some, definitely cumin and coriander, and probably some salt and pepper. And then this one, it's really yellow. This one I made from my Israeli cookbook, Zahav, and the yellow is from the turmeric. There's turmeric, and there's chili powder and some coriander. Any spices you have on hand, I'll bet you they would taste really good roasted on meats or vegetables. So the dry rub we're going to make for our spare ribs is really simple. This one is just 3 ingredients. It's just kosher salt, brown sugar, and Chinese 5-spice. And in case you haven't seen Chinese 5-spice before, you can buy it at most stores. The Asian grocery stores definitely have it, but I just got this one at our local Berkeley Bowl, and I'm sure Safeway would have it too. But what Chinese 5-spice is, it's not one spice. It's actually a combination of 5 spices, and this one has black pepper, cloves, cinnamon, fennel, and star anise. So it's all ground up together, and they call it 5-spice. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some brown sugar, and that'll add sweetness to our dry rub. So we're going to add 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. So I have my bowl here and my tablespoon measure. So 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. I'm using dark brown sugar, and I'm just filling it, packing my tablespoon. Okay. I'm just pressing it against the box so that it gets packed in. And this is enough dry rub for about 6 pounds of spare ribs, which is what I'm cooking today, what we're going to be roasting. So I have my brown sugar, and then we're going to add our Chinese 5-spice, so 1 tablespoon of the Chinese 5-spice. If you don't have Chinese 5-spice, don't worry, you can use another spice in your spice drawer, your spice cupboard. You could use coriander, you could use cumin, you could use paprika, yeah, you could use star anise, you could use, feel free to experiment. It's totally fine. And then here I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. Okay, so I'm going to take my spoon, I'm just going to mix it all together so that it gets to be uniformed. All the brown sugar chunks are mixed in and incorporated. So it's just 3 ingredients again: the sugar, the dark brown sugar, the kosher salt, and the Chinese 5-spice. 3 tablespoons of the brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of the Chinese 5-spice, and 1 tablespoon of the kosher salt. So there, that's our mixture. We're going to use it all. I'm going to use it all. For those of you making portobello mushrooms, you probably won't need to use all of this, so you can go ahead and just put this into a jar, whatever you don't use. So let's set this aside. I'm going to move aside my other dry rubs here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to process our spare ribs. So I have 2 3-pound racks of spare ribs. I'm going to take the packaging off. It's heavy, and they're big pieces of meat. So this one here has already been cut for me. See? So I'm just going to put it down. I'll just put it down on my cutting board for now. So I'll put this one here. This one's extra long. My butcher did not have, he didn't have 2 racks that were 3 pounds. I think this is more like 5 pounds. So I just said, I'll take the long one, and then I'll take a smaller one there. So to get this to fit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it in half. And first I see some like flaps of skin. Or fat, sorry, flaps of fat. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim that off with my really sharp utility knife or carving knife. And I'm not cutting off all the fat. I think fat is good because it adds more flavor and it bastes the meat when you're slow roasting it. But some of the excess fat I'm just going to cut off. Some of these bigger chunks that we don't need. So I'll cut that off and then we'll just toss it. So this is a really long piece of spare rib. So I'm just gonna find the bones. You can see here that, the spare rib has these long bones that go up and down. So I'm gonna find a part, a kind of a space of meat between 2 pieces of bone. I'm just gonna take my knife and cut through it like that. So kind of in the middle of the spare rib, I'm just gonna cut through with my knife, and I'm just taking my knife and running it along the bone, and it makes it easier to cut. So I just cut it down the length of the spare rib, down the bone, and you should work with a really sharp knife. I'll just put it there, and I'm just going to keep one piece of spare rib here, and then we're going to apply our dry rub. So take your hands are still meaty, but that's okay because we're going to toss the rest we're going to use up most of this dry rub. And I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to sprinkle it from on high, sprinkle it onto my spare rib, and I'm going to press it in as I do it. So I'm just sprinkling it over, making sure it gets evenly coated. All that salt and sugar and its 5-spice is going to incorporate in. I'm just going to mix it in like that. And press it down. And make sure you get the edges too. And just rub it. And then I'm going to turn it over. Do the same on the other side. You can see here there's like a flap of meat here. I'm going to make sure I get the spare rib under this dry rub underneath this flap too, so that every part of the meat gets covered in the spot from the dry rub. And remember, as you do it, you're going to press it in, and a nice even coating of the dry rub. And then when you're done with this, don't forget the edges. I'm putting a little bit, sprinkling a little bit along the edges. Turn it over, and then I'm going to put this on the sheet tray and then grab another piece. So I'm going to, once again, sprinkle from on high and press it in. Make sure you have an even coating. So you might have 4 pieces, which is perfectly fine. Like I said earlier, I had one really long rack and one smaller rack. And it looks like I have enough for all of my ribs. So the reason I chose spare ribs is because it's we haven't cooked pork together yet, right? Yeah, we haven't cooked pork together yet. But I also thought it'd be fun for us to practice roasting meat on the bone. And I've said this before, but roasting meat on the bone means more flavor. Any kind of meat that you're roasting with the bone on always has more flavor. So we're going to slow roast this in the oven. So I'm taking my 3rd piece here, and then just going to use the rest of my dry rub, sprinkling over it, pressing it in, and we're going to put it in the oven. Your oven should be preheating at around 350, and once you put it in, it's going to slowly roast in the oven. The fat's going to start to melt, and it's going to baste the meat, and then the sugar and the salt is going to dissolve and kind of work its way into the meat too. So I'm just going to pour the rest of my dry rub over. There we go. And just press it in. I have some dry rub on my cutting board, so I'm just going to take the edges here and kind of wipe it into the leftover dry rub on my cutting board. Make sure every part of the meat is coated with a fine layer. And we're good. So I'm going to put my ribs on the sheet tray. I'm putting it concave, meaning the spare rib rack is kind of like a little bit curved up like this. I'm putting it with the curvy side up. So to me, this is upside down, but this is the curvy side up for me. So the meatier side is facing up. And you can put it all onto your sheet tray. If it doesn't all fit perfectly, it's okay. You can kind of overlap them a little bit because they'll shrink. And while my hands are still dirty, I'm going to go ahead and transfer all this to the sink. But I'm going to show you, my ribs are overlapping a little bit. It's fine. It's totally fine. And then I'll be right back. I'm just going to put this into the sink and wash my hands. So we have our ribs, and the other thing we're going to do is we're going to add some water to it. So I have a measuring cup here. I'm going to put in about 1.5 cups of water, and that'll kind of help us steam the meat a little bit as it slowly roasts. So I'm pouring it very carefully onto the sheet pan. Oops, it's okay if you spill a little bit. It's not a ton of water, but just enough to add some moisture. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to cover it with another layer of foil. It's a big long sheet. And again, I'm going to cover it with 2 layers because it doesn't cover it all the way. You can see here there's still a gap. So I'm going to take another sheet of foil and then cover it. And then this goes in the oven. Your oven should be preheated to 350. Be very careful lifting it. It's pretty heavy. This is like over 6 pounds of meat and some water in there. So be very careful. I'm putting it in the oven, and it's going on the middle rack. And then it's going to sit in there until we meet again on Sunday at 5 o'clock. So I'll see you then. Have a good rest of your weekend. Oh, and feel free to do this right before you put it into the oven. If you want to do this on Sunday afternoon, that's perfectly fine, just as long as it goes in by 4 o'clock sharp. Okay, thanks. Bye.